The Romans were most to be feared when they stood in real danger. A quote from Polybius, author of The Rise of the Roman Empire. Hello and welcome to the Western Traditions podcast. My name is Rob Paxton, and this is the 18th episode of The Roman Empire, a series about ancient Roman history. So far, we have come to the year 216 BC and the disastrous defeat of the Roman legions at the Battle of Cannae. Given the amount of danger that Rome was in at that juncture, one might have easily expected a capitulation of some sort, for Rome to ask for terms of peace perhaps. Certainly the Carthaginian mind would go in that direction. After so many battlefield losses and the presence of a powerful enemy army just a short march from Rome, it made sense to negotiate a peace, to surrender faraway territories like those in Spain, for instance, in exchange for safety. This, in fact, is essentially what Carthage had done decades ago at the end of the First Punic War. In the last year of that conflict, Rome had been everywhere victorious, and though she did not have an army near Carthage itself at that point, that had not been a far-off prospect with Carthage's navy scattered and her army stranded in Sicily. So Carthage had swallowed her pride and negotiated a humiliating peace in order to survive. So again, it made a kind of sense to think that Rome would do the same. But that also betrays a lack of understanding, a lack of learning. If there is anything that one learns from the history of Rome, it is that the Romans do not give up easily. Some historians have looked back on that year, 216 BC, and additionally criticized Hannibal for failing to take advantage of the moment. Supremely victorious in the field, Rome's largest army crushed, and Rome itself just a short distance away, Hannibal chose not to march on the enemy capital, chose not to besiege Rome. One of his cavalry commanders by the name of Hannibal lamented this lost opportunity as soon as Hannibal announced his decision to avoid the siege of Rome. "You, Hannibal, know how to win a victory," Hannibal sadly commented, "but you do not know how to use one." A critical point of view suggests that Hannibal lost his nerve here and failed to deliver the knockout punch finally required to win the war. Will Durant comments that the entire city of Rome was in a delirious panic for about a month, and had Hannibal marched on it right away, he might have won that much-desired capitulation from the Roman Senate. But there are also at least a couple good reasons to think otherwise, and to sympathize somewhat with Hannibal's dilemma. First of all, Hannibal, the Carthaginian warlord, did not have siege equipment, not the kind he would have needed to besiege a city like Rome. It was one thing to surround and assail a small, walled town in the hinterlands of Italy. It was quite another to besiege Rome, a city that had now become one of the world's metropolises. So any direct move against Rome would have been doomed in that respect. Secondly, Hannibal had probably been a little alarmed by the failure of the Italian countryside to rally to his cause and to abandon alliances with Rome. All through 217 and 216 BC, he had been expecting to hear more about uprisings across the land and to receive envoys from random parts of Italy pleading with him for assistance in throwing off the shackles of Rome. In that moment, after the victory at Cannae, he had as yet not received many such offers. For the first 2 years of the war, the Latin allies of Rome had been quietly watching Rome fail in battle. It was not enough for the Romans to fail once or even twice. They had done so in the First Punic War and had always managed to pull through. And God help the traitors whom she discovered when things eventually turned back Rome's way. No, if the allies and subjects of Rome were to give her up, they had to be sure that Rome was going down this time. So for 2 years, Hannibal surely had been impressed with the idea that nothing could pull other cities away from the clutches of Rome, and that to take his army within reach of that great city, which still had its defenders, while Rome's allies only looked on in curiosity, would be to risk the complete destruction of his army. Alas, for Hannibal, he did not live in an age of faster communication, because it was this victory at Cannae that began to pry allies away from Rome, but he would not know that right away. As he wintered and 216 BC became 215 BC, he began to receive embassies, some from far away, even from Greece. People were now finally willing to risk Rome's wrath because it seemed like a suitable champion for their cause had come. There, in Apulia, in southeastern Italy, Hannibal possibly rued his conservative turn immediately after the battle, and he must have pondered Maharbal's words that he knew how to win a victory, but not how to use one. His regret probably entertained more than one cause, too. He was getting older. Now in his 30s, he was in the prime of life for this venture. Alexander the Great, though, had conquered the world by this age, and he, Hannibal, had yet to truly conquer anything. But he was also getting worn down. Hannibal had lost an eye due to some ill-described illness in the histories that had afflicted him that momentous year when he had no time to listen to his physicians and to rest and heal, and so he had lost all vision in that eye. Still, perhaps he had missed his moment, but there might be others. Rome had, unfortunately, already had time to regroup by the winter that brought the new year, 215 BC, but Hannibal was acquiring new allies. Ambassadors from all over were approaching him with offers of alliance. His troops were resting, and by capturing cities on the Adriatic coast, he had reestablished direct communication with Carthage by sea. Even now, he might be finally acquiring the means with which to bring down Rome, his ancestral enemy, against whom he had once sworn a blood oath to Baal Hammon, alongside his now deceased father. As it turned out, though, the next 5 years were going to be disappointing for everyone involved in this bloody struggle for domination of the West. Rome had certainly not given up. The Second Punic War is not so much a story of a Rome that conquers, but rather the story of a Rome that struggles and overcomes. Never since Rome's first appearance in the annals of history had the city been so endangered, unless the legend about the Sabines breaching the walls in the 7th century BC was more than just an inspiring story. First of all, Rome's losses were immense. After the battle at Cannae, the total wartime casualties were now beyond 100,000 in killed, wounded, and captured. This total would have easily constituted a fifth, possibly, or more of the adult men in Rome and in the cities of her allies. No wonder the populace of the city was delirious with terror after the loss at Cannae, the flower of her manhood bleeding out across the expanse of Italy. But amid the terror, and even immersed certainly in the guilt surrounding his poor judgment and performance at Cannae, the defeated consul Varro did not stop being consul. He rallied the remnants of his forces, maybe only 10 or 15,000 men of disparate formations and units, and he kept watch on Hannibal's victorious army. He did not leave his post until the Senate had sent Marcellus to replace him. At this juncture in the histories of Rome, I am struck again by the oligarchy of competence that the Romans maintained. And what I mean is this. In any other culture, when a man like Marcellus or Fabius came forward and achieved great victories, we generally see him move to the throne to rule over a city-state until he dies, whether of age or in an assassination attempt or in combat. And then the cycle repeats with another powerful man assuming his place. But Rome kept a corral of such men and simply rotated them in and out of power. Consider that Fabius had been dictator now twice, but at the time of the battle at Cannae, he was just another senator. Now, yes, he was definitely an influential senator and a power to be reckoned with, but he did not hold, nor did he seem to vie for, supreme power. Consider Marcellus. We learned in a previous episode about his spolia opima. He was the last Roman to ever achieve this nearly unique accomplishment, to rule as consul and to simultaneously kill an enemy king in personal combat, and to be feted in a triumph, memorializing the occasion. Yet after this high point, he had returned to the ranks of the Senate to await his next opportunity to serve Rome. and now he came forward to once again rescue his people. But make no mistake, and this may be a spoiler for you, Marcellus does not go on to become a dictator or a king in Rome. He will serve nobly in this war on more than one occasion, but he will never grasp for total power. Neither will any of the other great men who serve Rome during this war. Was all this done out of genuine patriotism, these sacrifices for Rome, or was it an ingenious part of Rome's political system, which enabled it to reap the benefits of service from great and charismatic men without suffering their tyranny? Perhaps these men truly did love Rome and her society so much that they refused to turn their battle achievements into popular support for their own ascension to tyrannical power. But the Senate's collective fear of monarchy probably did much to deter anyone's aspirations for a permanent dictatorship. Each man knew that his peers would never tolerate his own mastery. Each noble and senator of Rome cherished his own independence so much and knew that his colleagues individually also cherished their own, and thus they all knew that reaching for the crown would result in death. Fast forward to the death of Julius Caesar nearly 200 years later, and perhaps you will see how lasting, how serious, and how ingrained this fear of monarchy was. However you view the situation, it is just remarkable that Rome could just pull out of the cupboard random men who could rise to a situation, rescue the city, and then quietly accept being sidelined for years to come as consul, as censor, as praetor, as governor, as general, as high priest, and so on. In fact, at this critical moment after Cannae, the Senate turned neither to Marcellus nor to Fabius or to any of the other great men previously mentioned. Yes, Fabius went on pulling strings in Rome, and Marcellus rescued the army, but it was Marcus Junius Pera who was made dictator. The dictatorship, you see, required only a competent man, not a genius like Hannibal, or a man practically cut from legend like Marcellus, in order for the position to serve Rome's needs. Pera scrapped together 4 fresh legions in the aftermath of the disaster at Cannae. He recruited underage boys. He freed 8,000 slaves in exchange for their military service. He even forgave debts and criminal punishments if a man would step forward and serve the nation in the army. As dictator, he could ramrod these decisions through the legislative process that would have otherwise balked and hesitated, being held back by special interests and ulterior motives. But either by necessity or by choice, the doctrine of Fabianism in warfare, in Italy at least, continued in use. No direct battle with Hannibal would be sought. The young boys, the slaves, and the criminals drafted into the army were meant for defense and extreme necessity. They were not meant to march in disciplined formation and launch an offensive against Hannibal's veteran soldiers. But there was more to Fabianism than just a hesitant approach to warfare. In fact, Fabianism was part of a growing conservatism in Rome, perhaps in response to the advent of all the novus homos, the new men of the recent generations, if not simply in response to the events of the war. In the last 10 years of history, since 225 BC, only 5 new families had been admitted into the nobility in Rome. The doors of opportunity for the upper, middle, and merchant classes were closing again. Many historians mark this epoch of Roman history as the beginning of the so-called Ciceronian Republican era of Rome, during which the Republic abides as a conservative society, strongly aristocratic, with a highly structured class system, ruled over by a Senate that reigned supreme. But this is also a generalization which requires a lot of qualifications. Roman society had been conservative in nature long before. Like most Western societies, it went through social pendulum swings from one ideology to another, and in particular from conservatism to liberalism and back. As the appearance of the novus homos among the senators demonstrates, there had been a recent period of opening to new possibilities and viewpoints among the leadership of Rome. Now the pendulum was simply swinging back. But to state that the Ciceronian Republic would continue for centuries down to the time of Cicero is also to overgeneralize. Obviously, with the recent combat losses among the senators, it might be necessary to revisit the idea of new admissions to the nobility in the near future. In fact, one of the first matters to be reviewed by the government of Rome after securing the defense of the city in 216 BC was to fill the 177 vacancies in the Senate, which had accumulated since the start of the war, most of those senatorial seats emptied by men now dead on a battlefield somewhere. The following century of Roman history would also see many popular uprisings and social instability, so we'll see just how well the quote-unquote Ciceronian Republic weathered those storms. Nevertheless, getting back to the Second Punic War, Fabius Maximus was ascendant, even more so as Cannae did not prove to be the last military disaster that year, if you can believe it. The Boii, the Gallic tribe in the far north of Italy, against whom the Romans had been at war for many years now, they were inspired by Hannibal's successes, and they massacred an entire force of 25,000 more Roman and allied soldiers. The newly elected consul in charge of that army, Lucius Postumius Albinus, was killed in the battle. The Boii decapitated his corpse, covered his skull in molten gold, and the king of the Boii would use it as a celebratory drinking cup for years to come. But the war was not contained to Italy, even though its greatest dramas had occurred there in the opening years of the conflict. As the war dragged on, Rome had to engage various enemies on different battlefields. We will begin a review of these other theaters in the war by looking at matters as they stood in Greece. Even prior to the officially recognized start of the Second Punic War, Rome had become involved in Greek politics. In a previous episode, I alluded to how Rome, after the First Punic War, began engaging directly in political matters among the Greeks living along the opposing Adriatic coastline from southern Italy. This was, in many ways, only natural, since Rome only solidified their control of southeastern Italy through events in that earlier war, and now, for the first time, they had reason to contact these Greek city-states across the Adriatic Sea. But they initiated this contact in a very ambitious Roman way. Soon the Romans achieved naval supremacy in these waters and became allies with some of the various powers in the region. The purpose behind these alliances, though, was very much imperial. Rome wasted no time in attempting to vie for supreme power. These alliances with whichever power, the Achaean League, the Spartans, the Illyrians, all had one purpose: to defy the king of Macedon. The kingdom of Macedon was a political descendant of the kingdom of Alexander the Great. He had conquered the entire Persian Empire and added it to his domain, but after his death in 323 BC, Alexander's generals had carved the empire up into several personal realms. By 306 BC, the kingdom of Macedon was established by Antigonus, a Macedonian general who had served under Alexander. This realm basically consisted of the older Macedonia, over which Philip II had ruled, along with many nearby territorial additions. The history of the dynasty established by Antigonus is as troubled as any Greek history. Nevertheless, by the time of Rome's involvement in Greek affairs nearly a century later, the descendants of Antigonus were still in charge, and they were always trying to assume control over other parts of Greece, which had since broken away. There were numerous breakaway realms in Greece by this time, among them the Achaean League, the Aetolian League, the Kingdom of Illyria, from whence had come Alexander's mother, Athens, of course, and also Sparta, which had regained its independence after Alexander's death. Polybius devotes many pages to these events in Greece and to the development of the Achaean League, and this makes sense because Polybius was a Greek from a city in the Achaean League, so he is naturally able to provide a great deal of commentary and detail about these matters. And I myself have considered adding another episode to The Greek Sun, my podcast series about ancient Greece, which would focus on the Achaean League. It's a fascinating political and military drama, and someday I may add such an episode to that series as a coda, but for the moment, it is sufficient to know that the appearance of the Romans in Greece marks the beginning of the end of the history of these squabbling successors to Alexander. However, Polybius's description of the Illyrian Wars does a great job of characterizing Roman political and military attitudes. Now, by 229 BC, a decade before the Second Punic War, Rome had become heavily involved commercially and diplomatically with the Greek states along the Adriatic coast, essentially where we find today the modern nation of Albania. The Illyrian peoples had a long history of piracy. Independent seamen from Illyria would set out and raid trading vessels that were crossing the Adriatic, and the government of Illyria typically did little, if anything, about this. At this time, in 229 BC, Illyria was ruled by a queen by the name of Teuta, a famously fierce woman, and fierce she would have had to have been to rule over such a nation of wily and aggressive men. Anyway, the long and short of it is that the Romans sent envoys to this Queen Teuta to complain of the piracy and to seek rectification of the situation. The queen declared that it was not the custom of the Illyrian kingdom to control the activities of its private citizens. In other words, the Roman Republic had an issue with the private citizens of Illyria, not with her or with her kingdom. One of the Roman ambassadors responded to the queen thus: "Queen Teuta, the Romans have an excellent tradition, which is that the state should concern itself with punishing those who commit private wrongs and with helping those who suffer them. With the gods' help, we shall do our best to make you reform the dealings of the kings of Illyria with their subjects." Now this enraged the queen. In response, as the ambassadors were on their way back to their ship, she sent men to assassinate them. Big mistake. Perhaps as a Greek, she was thinking that the Romans might only reply in a tit-for-tat fashion, killing some Illyrians, sinking one of their ships, etc., or simply escalating the situation a little bit. But that's not how the Romans roll. When the Senate heard about all this, they immediately declared war and called for the recruitment of additional legions to invade Illyria and organized hundreds of ships for the attack. The end result of it all was the First Illyrian War. Teuta was sent into exile, and the Romans established a quote-unquote protectorate over several coastal cities on the eastern side of the Adriatic, placing garrisons in several places. One of those places, by the way, was the city of Epidamnus, which was the location in which the Peloponnesian War got started. Anyway, Teuta eventually bought her own safety by paying the Romans off and giving up much of her territory. Now, the continuing saga in this area is long and complicated, and we will avoid it for the purposes of this podcast. If the nitty-gritty of it all intrigues you, read the third book of Polybius's History of the Rise of the Roman Empire. Rome, though, having established a foothold in Greece, would never retreat. Her involvement would continue throughout the Second Punic War as well until the eruption of the First Macedonian War. Naturally, Rome came into conflict with the kingdom of Macedon, whose rulers aspired always to resume something of their past glory and acquire dominion over more of Greece, and who were at constant war with one or more of the other realms in Greece. Enter Philip V, king of Macedon. Even when Rome had only begun to suffer at Hannibal's hands, even before Cannae, this aspirant to glory, who bore the name of Alexander's father, had plotted to take advantage of Rome's distraction and to seize territory from her in Greece. Earlier in the episode, I mentioned ambassadors arriving at Hannibal's camp in Italy after Cannae. Philip's envoys were among them. There was agreement in principle between the two powers, Carthage and Macedon, in their hatred of Rome, but little coordination. Philip had no plans to invade faraway Italy and to fight alongside Hannibal. But Philip soon invaded Illyria by sea, and he set a challenge for the senators of Rome, who were mostly concerned about kicking Hannibal out of Italy, but they also did not desire to lose any of their overseas dominions. A grueling, low-intensity war continued in Greece for many years as a result. The Romans made alliances with various Greek city-states, such as Sparta, and dueled with Macedon for many years. The conclusion of that conflict I leave for a future episode, when I bring the history of the Second Punic War to a close. Now, all of this going on about Greece may seem like a distraction from the greater story about the conflict between Rome and Carthage, but I refer you again to previous statements that I've made about the Punic Wars. Rome and Carthage were two big fish in a small pond. It's not small geographically, the Western Mediterranean is huge, but small culturally and financially. True, Western Europe would someday be the locus of culture and wealth, but that future was still, believe it or not, close to 2,000 years away. It is important to remember that to maintain this perspective that the West is, at the time of the Second Punic War, a backwater compared to the East, and would be for a long, long time. And there's a reason why Alexander's first goal was to conquer Persia, because Persia controlled the vast majority of the world's wealth, even if it did not control the actual geography of the entire world. Conquering the West was an unfulfilled afterthought for Alexander because it would have amounted to conquering little more than just territory. So Rome's interest in Greece is long-sighted. They knew that they must defeat Carthage in order to survive. But after ensuring their survival in the West, the road to vast wealth lay eastward. The Greek mainland is wealthy in many respects, but it is Greeks also who control Egypt under the Ptolemies, and they also control most of the Near East under the Seleucid Empire. But conquering Greece and Greek-ruled territories is something that will take the better part of the next 2 centuries. This first Macedonian War that broke out sometime around 214 BC would end not in the conquest of significant portions of Greece, but rather in a peace pact. Still, it was the next step in taking over Greece. Because once the Romans are on your doorstep, well, in the meantime, though, let's turn our eyes back westward and see how the war developed in Sicily and Africa in the years immediately after the terrible losses at Trasimene and Cannae. Sicily. For nearly 4 decades, since the very beginning of the First Punic War, King Hiero of Syracuse had been Rome's strongest ally. He had concluded a pact with the Romans after beginning that war as one of their enemies and had stayed remarkably true ever since. By the end of the First Punic War, the rest of Sicily had come under Rome's power. The island had become a literal breadbasket for Rome, supplying her with the grain needed to feed her people and her legions. But in 215 BC, when Rome was still trying to rally mainland Italy against the invader Hannibal and to retain her League of Allies and subject states, Hiero died. His son having already preceded him in death, the powers in Syracuse rallied around his grandson, and they rallied to the cause of rebellion and alliance with Carthage. Not all of Sicily went over to the Carthaginians, but if Syracuse was allowed to escape Rome's embrace without repercussions, it was obvious the rest of the island would soon go. Now, the factionalism that was going on inside Syracuse was as complicated as any that you hear about in any ancient Greek city. Without going into detail, I will only note that while the city was preparing to resist Rome, the new young king, the teenage grandson of Hiero, was assassinated by a Republican faction which vied against the monarchist factions in the city. The internal disorder that followed in Syracuse may have given Rome the time she needed to respond to the worsening situation in Sicily. Again, one is amazed at Roman survival here. Everything was going wrong. Hannibal roamed southern Italy freely, ransacking and pillaging and receiving city after city into his cause. The legions were caught up in overseas battles in Greece and Spain, and now the most important resource in Italy's empire, her food source in Italy, was being wrenched away from her by sedition. Possibly, the Senate of Rome understood at this point what Pericles had told the Athenians centuries before. They could no longer simply put down the crown. They couldn't give up. They could no longer simply relinquish the empire and return to being a minor republic in central Italy. Their choice was between holding on to their empire or becoming slaves. So Rome did what Rome always did best: punch back harder. They ordered Marcellus, the great hero of the decade before, to leave Italy as well defended as possible against marauding Hannibal, and to organize forces to head south into Sicily and to bring it back into Roman possession. This was no easy feat because most of southern Italy had now gone over to Hannibal. Places like Capua, a city on the same coast as Rome and only about 120 miles away, this large, prosperous city was one of the jewels in Hannibal's new crown as resistance leader. Thus, it took Marcellus until 213 BC to reach and besiege the city of Syracuse after brushing aside the Syracusan army. Until this point, Carthage had amazingly not bothered to intervene. Yes, the Carthaginians welcomed the betrayal of one of Rome's most integral allies, but they didn't bother to rush in and support this new territorial gain. Instead, they waited till Marcellus had already besieged the city to organize a new army under the general Hamilco and to send it to Sicily to relieve the siege. Marcellus battled this enemy while maintaining the siege of Syracuse, and then Hamilco, with a characteristic Carthaginian inability to see the crux of the matter in military situations, set off to conquer the rest of the island, thinking perhaps that Syracuse would hold on until he could bring the resources and the manpower of the rest of Sicily to bear on the besieging Romans. But the Romans knew what came first. Possession of Syracuse as a secure base from which to operate would soon bring back all of Sicily under their control, so they dug in and plotted and watched. Seaborne attempts at infiltration of the city failed due to the presence of the Greek mathematical and engineering genius Archimedes, who lived in Syracuse and designed a number of ingenious machines and techniques to defend his home city. The reports that have survived about his inventions are sometimes hard to believe, such as a giant lever and claw that reached down from the sea walls to pick up attacking Roman ships and to cast them down to their destruction, or a heat ray created using mirrors to literally set fire to enemy ships and sailors. Down through the years, researchers of all kinds have attempted to theorize or even replicate how Archimedes might have devised such miraculous defenses. Nevertheless, Roman tenacity won out. In 212 BC, Marcellus found an opportunity to scale a lightly guarded portion of the walls of Syracuse during an important festival inside the city. Now, anyone who has listened to my Greek Sun series knows how important such religious festivals were to the Greeks and how often their celebration complicated their own efforts to defend themselves. History repeated itself here. While they were distracted in the festival, Marcellus's men scaled the walls and captured the Epipolae, a plateau within the walls and above the city proper. From there, it was easy to seize the rest of the city. It is said that Marcellus wept as he looked down from this plateau on the streets of the city below and knew that he would not be able to restrain his men, who had fought and gone hungry and survived disease for years and were now set to unleash their pent-up frustration on the populace. He gave orders limiting the massacre, but to little avail. Eventually, he ordered that Archimedes should be preserved, but also that brilliant Greek was murdered in the sacking of that city. The Carthaginians would soon come and camp outside the walls in an attempt to besiege the Romans who were now inside the city. But the victory at Syracuse was not simply a territorial addition in the war, it was a morale booster as well. Though the Carthaginians, in a classic example of too little, too late, now poured more forces into Sicily, by 210 BC, the Romans were back in complete control of the island. Just across the sea from Sicily, tantalizingly close, was the Carthaginian homeland. Rome had devised typically ambitious plans at the beginning of the war to immediately invade Africa and to teach the Carthaginians a harsh lesson. The series of immediate disasters in northern Italy, though, had forced the Senate to redirect troops to fight for the very homeland of Rome instead. So Rome's grand plans for Africa did not come to fruition, not yet. During these middle deadlock years of the war, though, the Roman Senate did not completely forget about possibilities in Carthage's homeland. They encouraged the Numidians on the borders of Carthage to seize the opportunity to turn on their oppressive neighbor. In 213 BC, Syphax, a Numidian king, openly allied with Rome and started off an African war. Syphax received some Roman support, especially in the form of a military advisor to help train his soldiers to fight Carthage. And it's a move that sounds exactly like some modern-day proxy war in which quote-unquote advisors train and supply local troops as part of a greater global war. So the war effort staggered on in Greece, in Sicily, and in Africa, with few clear victories for several years. In Spain, though, The Romans were unknowingly brewing a new kind of formula for war and cultivating an army and a general who would find the way to finally defeat the Carthaginians. You might recall how I described the beginning of this war and Hannibal's invasion of Italy, how Hannibal was first detected by a consular army under Publius Cornelius Scipio at the river Rhone, and how Scipio then sent his army on to Spain, its original intended destination, while he himself returned to Italy to prepare for Hannibal's invasion. Let's get back now to that army which Scipio sent on to Spain. Commanded by Scipio's brother Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio, this army landed in northeast Iberia in 218 BC and made alliances with local tribes, some of whom were certainly still upset about Hannibal's rampage through their territory on his way to southern Gaul. Over the next few years, things went back and forth in Spain, but even stalemate there was positive for Rome. Whatever kept Hasdrubal from reinforcing his brother Hannibal in Italy was a good thing as far as Rome was concerned. Victory in Spain was desirable, of course, but not necessary. So long as the conflict continued there, it allowed the Senate to focus on saving the Roman heartland. After Publius Cornelius Scipio recovered from the wounds he had suffered fighting Hannibal in 218 BC, he went on to Spain and resumed command of the army he had originally been intended to lead. The military stalemate endured until 215 BC, each side possessing roughly 25 soldiers of all kinds, just to give you an idea of the forces involved. Definitely a side theater of the war, you might think. But that year, the Scipio brothers soundly defeated Hasdrubal and scattered his army. Hannibal's brother escaped the battle, and he sent an appeal to Carthage for more troops. And so, while Hannibal lingered on and with virtually no support from home in Italy, Carthage sent to Spain Mago Barca, another younger brother of Hannibal's, along with nearly 15,000 infantry, cavalry, and elephants, as well as 1,000 talents of silver to fund the recruitment of local mercenaries. Spain, you see, as the source of Carthage's silver, was much more important to the Carthaginian rulers than victory in Italy, even though such a victory in Italy would have ensured them all the wealth of the West in the long run. Now, you may shake your head at such obtuseness, but remember that you live today surrounded by such examples. We live in a world where both governments and corporations chase after short-term gains and profits at the expense, often, of long-term survival. Carthage's management of the war really should not surprise us. It was very predictably human. It is Rome's ability to overcome such human failings, to think in terms of long-term survival rather than immediate satisfaction, which should astonish us. But these reinforcements did save Spain for Carthage. Hasdrubal and his brother Mago continued to hold on to southern Spain with these reinforcements, and in the coming years, the Barca brothers would receive more reinforcements, and so would the Scipio brothers in the north of Spain. Both sides suffered, however, from varying levels of lack of support. For instance, both navies, Carthaginian and Roman, for instance, were hard-pressed to find sailors and to build ships. Such were the demands that the war was making on their populations and their resources. Rome was now manning skeleton crews on their fleets in a handful of theaters in Greece, the Adriatic, the waters around Sicily, around Sardinia and Corsica, where rebellions threatened constantly, and along the coast of Spain. As it was, there really were no great fleet battles during this period. The Carthaginian fleet, for instance, that brought reinforcements to Mago, could not stay in Spain, and it couldn't help him because it had to return to the capital where it was also needed. Every army on both sides of the war was struggling with insufficient supplies, insufficient numbers of men, and often insufficient morale. In the winter of 211 BC, though, the Scipio brothers decided that it was time to break the deadlock. Both sides had swollen the sizes of their armies with the addition of local allies as well as help from their respective homes. And as spring approached, the Carthaginian forces were spread out in 3 camps where they had wintered. Before they could unite, the plan was that a large portion of the Roman army, under Publius, would find and destroy one of these smaller Carthaginian armies, while a smaller Roman force, under his younger brother's command, would contain any other enemy army that tried to interfere. Later, the two brothers could unite and destroy the remaining inferior Carthaginian forces. Early that spring, then, Publius marched with his legions and his allies into the upper valley of the Baetis River, which is today known as the Guadalquivir, while his brother Gnaeus held station with a smaller force and kept watch for Hasdrubal. Some weeks later, the Senate in Rome received a strange message from the field command in Spain. It came not from the Scipio brothers, nor even from one of their commanders. The writer of the letter identified himself as Lucius Marcius Septimius. He was from a knightly family, not from a senatorial family, and one of the lower-ranking officers in the legions. Septimius announced in the letter that he had succeeded to the command of the remaining Roman forces in Spain. His patched-together units, he told the Senate, contained less than half of the foreman Roman numbers in Spain, but they were still holding on to the northern bank of the Ebro River, and both the Scipio brothers were dead. He urged the Senate to send clothing and food to supply the remaining soldiers as they guarded against any Carthaginian movements into northern Spain. What had happened? The Senate was overwhelmed. They were used to good news from Spain. It turns out that Publius had been caught between two enemy forces while trying to make his surprise attack, and he and his army were destroyed. His younger brother, Gnaeus, was pursued by Hasdrubal, who now had the preponderance of forces which the Romans had intended to have. Unable to escape, Gnaeus retreated to a hilltop in the Tater River Valley, deep in Carthaginian territory, and made a last stand. There were very few trees on the hilltop, so the legions quickly built fortifications with just their baggage and saddles, and thus they received the Carthaginian charge. In the chaos of the disaster that followed, a number of Romans and allies escaped singly and in small groups. Gnaeus Scipio, though, lay somewhere dead among the broken Roman defensive works. These remnants of the troops regrouped, hurrying north to Roman territory. Once across the Ebro River, they elected Septimius as their commander, and he sent that letter to Rome. Now, Septimius would save northern Spain for Rome and hold on until new forces and a new commander were sent by a Senate desperate to hold on to what was left in Spain. The Senate, though, would not forget what this novus homo, this new man Septimius, had done for Rome. Later in the war, he would be given a command in Spain and see it all through to the end. Again, with the benefit of hindsight, we see the errors in Carthaginian strategy. Now was the perfect opportunity to mop up Roman defenders in Spain and then march to Italy, reinforcing Hannibal. But for whatever reasons, the commanders in Spain disagreed among themselves, and they wasted time while Septimius reorganized his forces and stiffened defenses in northeastern Spain. The new commander in Spain, Gaius Claudius Nero, and the reinforcements that were sent with him did not arrive until late that year, simply because Rome had no men to spare until then. Based on what little we know about the next few months, Nero only engaged in skirmishes with the Carthaginians, but critically, he continued to stabilize and secure the region. What happened next, politically, is still a matter of debate. There was apparently a popular vote in the lower assemblies of Rome and not in the Senate to elect Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son of the same Publius who had just died fighting in Spain, to take command of the army in Spain. We can only speculate on how this came about or why the vote occurred in the lower assemblies and why the Senate decided to simply not take a side in the matter. It does not appear that Nero had fouled things up. In fact, he would be elected consul in 207 BC. And Scipio was very young for such a command, possibly not even 25 years old when he was shipped over to Spain with 10,000 reinforcements. Not only was he young, but he had never even held high office in Rome. Yet now he would be in command of an entire theater of war. However it came to be, though, it was Rome's best decision yet. Over the next 5 years, Scipio would batter the Carthaginians in Spain into near submission and leave trusted commanders behind to finish the job, so that he could return to Rome, seek election as consul, and bring a decisive end to this long and bloody war. In the next episode, we will hear all about the details about Scipio's war in Spain and how he came to invade Africa and to earn the nickname by which he is still known today, Scipio Africanus. Until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.